What if the most terrifying figures of the Holocaust weren't hardened soldiers, but young women with braids and soft smiles? In 1940, thousands gathered to watch their shocking fate unfold. Under the gray sky of Gdansk in 1946, a silence heavier than stone fell upon the gathered crowd. Thousands of men, women, and children stood shoulder to shoulder in a vast square, their eyes fixed on a row of wooden scaffolds. The air carried no celebration, no shouts of vengeance, only the tense breath of a city that had endured unspeakable loss. On those platforms stood not generals or masterminds of war, but young women, barely in their 20s, whose faces could have belonged to secretaries, waitresses, or farmers' daughters. Yet behind those ordinary features lay the imprint of extraordinary cruelty. They had been guards at Stutthof, one of the lesser-known camps of the Nazi system, where death was routine and violence was daily ritual. How did such women, once seen as harmless, even fragile, become instruments of terror in a machine built for extermination? How did braids, pressed skirts, and polite smiles mask a capacity for brutality equal to any male SS officer? And why, when the war had ended and the Reich lay in ashes, did justice demand their punishment in front of the world? These were not distant figures hidden behind policy or orders. They were the hands that struck, the voices that commanded, the eyes that selected who would live and who would march toward the gas chambers. Their actions could not be erased by excuses of obedience or ignorance. The evidence was written in scars, in memories, in the very soil soaked with the suffering of their victims. That morning in Gdansk was not merely an execution. It was a reckoning with the truth that evil wears many faces, and that the shadows of war reach even into the lives of those least expected. The ropes tightened, the platforms dropped, and the silence of the crowd deepened. History had delivered its verdict, and the world was left with a haunting question. How could ordinary women become architects of horror? In the autumn of 1939, as German troops marched across Poland, a modest camp was established on the Baltic coast. At first, it was intended as a detention site for Polish intellectuals and political opponents, a temporary holding ground in the chaos of occupation. But as the war expanded and the Nazi system of extermination took shape, Stutthof evolved into something far darker. Wooden barracks multiplied, barbed wire stretched wider, and the smoke of crematoriums began to curl into the northern sky. It was not as infamous as Auschwitz or Treblinka, but for more than 110,000 men, women, and children who passed through its gates, it became a place of despair without end. Stutthof was not simply a prison. It was a carefully engineered mechanism of annihilation. By 1942, gas chambers had been installed, and the camp was integrated into the machinery of the final solution. Jews deported from across Europe arrived alongside Soviet prisoners of war, Polish resistance members, and countless others labeled as enemies. The methods of death were varied and relentless: suffocation in sealed chambers, starvation in overfilled barracks, executions by firing squad, and endless forced labor that drained bodies until they collapsed. Nearly 65,000 never walked out alive. For those who did survive, every day was marked by the shadow of death, the sound of boots on gravel, and the cold voice of command. It was within this brutal landscape that women were drawn into service. They were not passive clerks or background assistants. They were trained, uniformed, and armed with authority. They supervised labor details, enforced discipline with fists, whips, or dogs, and stood guard as prisoners were herded toward their final moments. Some commanded entire blocks of inmates. Others took part in selections, raising a hand to signal who would live and who would vanish into smoke. Their presence shattered the illusion that cruelty belonged only to men. In Stutthof, women became active participants in a daily ritual of degradation and death. Numbers tell one story, but the atmosphere told another. Prisoners awoke before dawn, lined up under freezing winds for roll call, often standing for hours without food or shelter. Any stumble, any whisper, could bring a blow or worse. Work was ceaseless, hauling stones, digging ditches, carrying corpses. Hunger gnawed at every thought, while disease spread unchecked. The barracks reeked of sweat, sickness, and the stench of bodies piled too long without burial. Fear was not occasional. Fear was the fabric of existence, and within that fabric the voices of female guards cut sharp and merciless, binding terror to routine. By the final year of the war, Stutthof had become a crucible of suffering, its death marches stretching across frozen landscapes as German forces retreated. Thousands perished on those forced treks, shot where they fell, left to freeze in ditches, driven onward by guards who showed no mercy. The camp itself was reduced to ruins by the time the Soviets arrived. Yet even among its ashes, evidence remained. Piles of clothing, discarded belongings, documents, and above all, survivors' testimonies. They revealed the truth that Stutthof was not an accident of war, nor merely one camp among many. It was a place where violence was woven into daily life, where ordinary routines masked extraordinary horror, and where women, too, held the power to decide between life and death. Among the shadows of Stutthof, certain names emerged, names whispered by survivors with trembling voices, remembered not for compassion, but for cruelty carried out with chilling precision. These women were not generals. They were not architects of ideology. They were ordinary faces that became extraordinary symbols of brutality. Each one left behind a legacy carved in pain, a legacy that would lead them, inevitably, to the gallows in Gdansk. Jenny Wanda Barkman was only 24, strikingly beautiful, with delicate features that seemed more suited for a fashion magazine than a concentration camp. Prisoners called her the hyena of Stutthof. Her appearance was immaculate, hair neatly braided, uniform spotless, shoes polished. Yet beneath that polished exterior lay a merciless heart. Survivors recalled how she carried a riding crop, striking without warning, her lips pressed into a cold smile as inmates crumpled at her feet. She directed selections with a casual wave, consigning women, children, and the elderly to the gas chambers. Barkman did not need to shout. Her presence alone sent shivers down the lines of prisoners, for they knew that her beauty concealed death. Iwa Parodies projected a different image. She was remembered for her calm voice, her soft smile, and her graceful movements. But beneath that mask of serenity, there was no mercy. Parodies supervised groups of women and children, marching them toward trains and chambers of gas with quiet efficiency. Witnesses testified that she struck crying mothers, forced terrified children forward, and sometimes delivered blows even after the victims had been locked inside. The contrast was chilling. A gentle face, a soothing demeanor, paired with an unshakable commitment to destruction. She did not rant, she did not rage. She enforced death with silence, and that silence was often more terrifying than screams. Then there was Gerda Steinhoff, a farmer's daughter turned SS overseer at the age of 23. Tall, stern, with an unwavering gaze, she quickly rose to command respect among her peers. Survivors described her as unyielding, her every step echoing authority. She organized roll calls, enforced punishments, and personally pointed out prisoners for extermination. One witness remembered her selecting a pregnant woman for death with a simple gesture. her face expressionless, her voice firm. Steinhoff did not seek excuses or disguise her role. She embodied the cold efficiency of the camp, a living reminder that obedience combined with ambition could be just as lethal as hatred. Elizabeth Becker stood apart in her silence. Only 21 when she arrived at Stutthof. She seemed shy, reserved, almost timid. But her youth and quiet nature did not shield her from complicity. Survivors recalled her presence during selections, her eyes fixed forward, her hands guiding prisoners into lines that led to death. She did not strike often. She did not scream. But she obeyed without question, and her obedience alone was deadly. In the machinery of annihilation, silence was not innocence. Silence was participation, and Becker's calm compliance made her as guilty as those who lashed out with cruelty. These women were not monsters in appearance. They were not towering figures of power. They were young, ordinary, sometimes even graceful. Yet each chose, in her own way, to embrace the role of executioner. Their actions proved that evil does not always arrive in the form of thunderous speeches or brutal force. Sometimes it comes with a whisper, a glance, a soft hand pointing toward the abyss. In Stutthof, their names became synonymous with terror, and their faces etched forever into the memory of those who survived. Dawn at Stutthof did not begin with light or warmth. It began with the shrill blast of whistles, the bark of orders, and the shuffle of thousands of weary feet dragged from wooden barracks into the freezing air. Prisoners stood in endless rows, shoulders hunched, bodies trembling from cold and hunger. Roll call could last hours. Those who fainted were kicked, beaten, or left on the ground to die. The female guards walked among them, their boots striking against the frozen earth, their eyes sharp, their voices cutting through the silence like blades. Survival was not measured in days, but in breaths stolen between commands. Daily life was a cycle of humiliation and exhaustion. Work details marched beyond the gates to haul stones, chop wood, or dig ditches in endless repetition. Inside the camp, others carried corpses, scrubbed floors, or performed meaningless tasks designed only to break their spirit. Food was a watery soup, a crust of bread, never enough to sustain, always enough to torment. Disease spread quickly in the overcrowded barracks. Lice crawled across skin, coughs echoed through the night, and the stench of sickness mingled with the ever-present smoke of the crematorium. For many, each sunrise was not a gift, but a sentence, to suffer one more day in the shadow of death. The cruelty of the guards was woven into every hour. Some carried whips, others unleashed dogs, all eager to remind prisoners that their lives held no value. A stumble while carrying stones could bring a blow to the head. A whispered word during labor could end in a beating. Some prisoners were forced to perform grotesque tasks, singing as they carried the dead, scrubbing floors with toothbrushes, or kneeling in mud for hours as rain poured down. The goal was never efficiency, it was degradation. It was to strip away humanity until nothing remained but despair. Even within this landscape of suffering, moments of quiet defiance flickered. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread, a corner of a blanket, a whispered word of comfort when no guard was near. These gestures, small and fragile, were acts of resistance against a system designed to extinguish hope. Yet the guards, women as well as men, worked tirelessly to crush even these sparks. Informants lurked everywhere. Punishments fell swiftly. Trust was dangerous. Compassion could be fatal. For the female overseers, this brutality became routine. To them, ordering a beating or pushing a prisoner toward death was no more extraordinary than checking a list or issuing a command. They walked the camp with confidence, their uniforms crisp, their authority unquestioned. The suffering of thousands unfolded before their eyes each day, but to them it was simply work. In Stutthof, cruelty was not an outburst of rage. It was the daily rhythm of existence, and in that rhythm, the women who served as guards became both the enforcers of terror and its most chilling symbols. By the winter of 1945, the Reich was collapsing. The Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, and the once mighty fortress of Nazi control began to crumble. In Stutthof, the command came swiftly and without mercy. Evacuate the camp, erase the evidence, leave nothing behind. What followed was not liberation, but another chapter of torment. Thousands of men, women, and children were forced from their barracks, driven into the snow, and ordered to march westward into the unknown. These were the death marches, an ordeal as brutal as the camp itself, where cold and hunger struck with the same cruelty as bullets and whips. The columns of prisoners stretched for miles, winding through frozen forests and desolate roads. Thin shoes offered no protection from ice, and the ragged uniforms did nothing against the biting wind. At every step, exhaustion claimed new victims. Some stumbled, some collapsed, some simply refused to rise again. For them, there was no reprieve. A gunshot rang out, a body fell into the ditch, and the column moved on. Guards barked orders, rifles raised, dogs snapping at the heels of the desperate. Among those guards were women, the same faces that had haunted the camp, still enforcing obedience, still wielding power over life and death, even as the Reich itself burned around them. Hunger gnawed at the marchers like a living thing. Snow was scooped from the roadside and swallowed as the only source of moisture. Crusts of bread, when they appeared, were fought over with trembling hands. The weakest were pushed aside, trampled by the mass of bodies driven forward without pause. Nights were no refuge. Prisoners collapsed on the frozen ground, bodies pressed together for warmth, only to awaken beside corpses stiff with frost. Disease spread quickly, unchecked, while the smell of death followed the columns like a shadow that could not be shaken. For the guards, the march was a test of authority. Their weapons ensured silence. Their blows demanded obedience. A woman who faltered might be struck down by a female overseer whose face betrayed neither pity nor hesitation. Witnesses later recalled how these women seemed almost immune to the suffering around them, their discipline unbroken, their determination unwavering. Even as the German lines disintegrated, the cruelty of the camp was carried on to the roads of Europe. The marches became moving prisons, rolling graveyards, where the boundaries between captivity and death disappeared. When the Red Army finally reached the ruins of Stutthof, they found only emptiness. Barracks stripped bare, crematoria cold, the air heavy with silence. What remained were fragments, abandoned clothing, discarded belongings, piles of documents, and the voices of a few survivors who staggered back from the marches. Their testimony spoke of endless snow, of bodies left unburied, of the guards who maintained their cruelty until the very end. Stutthof had fallen, but the suffering it had produced did not end with liberation. It trailed across the frozen landscapes of Poland and into the memories of those who lived to tell. The death marches were the final echo of a system built on annihilation, and they revealed that even in the last days, the machinery of cruelty did not falter. In the spring of 1946, the city of Gdansk prepared for a trial that would echo far beyond its walls. It was not Nuremberg, where the architects of war faced judgment. This was different. Here, in a Polish courtroom scarred by occupation, the accused were not distant commanders or hidden bureaucrats. They were the faces remembered from the barbed wire of Stutthof. They were guards, women and men alike, whose cruelty had been etched into the minds of survivors. The trial promised answers, but more than that, it promised a reckoning. 11 women took their places among the accused, seated beside male SS officers. Some were barely older than the victims they once tormented. They wore plain civilian clothing, their hair neatly arranged, their hands bound or folded in silence. Jenny Wanda Barkman sat upright, her beauty still striking but now hollow, her eyes fixed on the floor. Ewa Paradis maintained composure, her lips pressed tight, her demeanor calm. Gerda Steinhoff radiated the same stern defiance that had once terrified prisoners. Elizabeth Becker, quiet and pale, seemed almost fragile, yet her name appeared again and again in testimony. The sight was jarring. Ordinary young women, no longer draped in uniforms, but charged with crimes against humanity. The courtroom filled with voices that could not be silenced. Survivors stepped forward, their words trembling, their memories sharp as knives. They spoke of beatings without cause, of children torn from mothers' arms, of guards laughing as prisoners were driven into chambers of gas. One remembered Barkman striking with her whip until blood ran down a prisoner's face. Another recalled Paradis ordering women forward, her calm smile hiding merciless intent. Witnesses pointed at Steinhoff, describing how her gestures sealed fates in the selection lines. Even Becker, who rarely raised her voice, was accused of guiding victims to their deaths with quiet obedience. The stories were harrowing, and they shattered any attempt at denial. The accused offered defenses as fragile as paper. They claimed they were only following orders. They insisted they were powerless, that their roles were minor, that they did not fully understand what was happening. But the weight of testimony crushed these excuses. The survivors' voices overlapped, their accounts consistent, their pain undeniable. Documents supported their claims, lists of duties, rosters of guards, signatures that tied each woman to the machinery of death. The truth was laid bare. They had not merely witnessed atrocity. They had enacted it. The judges listened in silence, their verdicts inevitable. The air inside the courtroom grew heavy, every word a reminder of the chasm between ordinary life and unimaginable cruelty. Some of the accused sat motionless, others bowed their heads, a few stared defiantly at the witnesses who condemned them. Yet all of them knew that the sentence would be severe. When the final day arrived, the judgments were delivered without hesitation. Death for those whose brutality had been most visible. Long imprisonment for others whose guilt was beyond doubt, though their crimes were less notorious. Justice, at last, had spoken. But the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a statement to the world that gender, age, or rank offered no shield against responsibility. That even those who had once served drinks in cafes or worked as secretaries could stand condemned for their role in a system of death. In Gdansk, history paused to record a simple truth. Participation in atrocity carries a price. For the women of Stutthof, that price would soon be paid on the gallows. In a gray morning in July 1946, the square near Gdansk's railway station filled with thousands of silent spectators. Men, women, and children gathered not for celebration, but for a grim spectacle that would close one of the darkest chapters of the war. Before them stood a series of wooden scaffolds, ropes hanging ready. 11 condemned prisoners were led forward, among them the young women whose names had haunted testimonies of Stutthof. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. Now justice was to be carried out in full view of the people. Jenny Wanda Barkman climbed the steps first. She moved with a strange composure, her youthful beauty unchanged but hollow, stripped of charm. She offered no words, no pleas, only silence as the rope was placed around her neck. Iwa Paradis followed, her gait faltering for a moment before she steadied herself, her face unreadable. Gerda Steinhoff marched forward with the same stern defiance that had once defined her presence in the camp. Elizabeth Becker appeared pale, almost ghost-like, her eyes cast downward. One by one, the women mounted the platforms, each step echoing louder than the last. The crowd held its breath. No jeers, no applause, only an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on every soul present. At the signal, the platforms dropped. Bodies fell, ropes snapped taut, and the square was filled with a silence more deafening than sound. It was the silence of a nation witnessing the end of its tormentors, the silence of justice delivered not behind closed doors, but in the open air. For a long moment, no one moved. The condemned swayed lifeless in the morning light, and the people of Gdansk stood frozen, caught between grief, vengeance, and relief. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind the gallows as stark reminders of what had transpired. The public executions marked more than punishment. They were symbols. They declared that cruelty cloaked in uniform would not be forgotten, that even the seemingly ordinary, young women once waitresses, clerks, farm girls, would be held accountable when they chose to enforce terror. For Poland, devastated by occupation and war, it was a message to the world. Justice was possible, even in the aftermath of horror. Yet it was also a warning. If such atrocities could be committed by those so unassuming, then evil could wear any face, in any place, at any time. The shadows of Stutthof did not vanish with the ropes tightening around those necks. They remained, in the memories of survivors, in the testimonies preserved, in the haunting truth that ordinary people had embraced extraordinary cruelty. The executions closed one chapter, but the legacy endured. They forced the world to confront a reality many preferred to ignore. The face of atrocity is not always monstrous. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it whispers, and sometimes, as in Gdansk, it is a young woman stepping onto a scaffold, facing the final judgment for the horrors she once delivered without hesitation.